시청자 여러분 안녕하십니까? Ytn과 한국외국어대학교가 공동 주최하는 제5회 중학생 영어토론대회 결승전을 지금부터 생방송으로 중계해드리겠습니다. 올해로 5회째를 맞이하는 이번 대회는 전국 중학생 149개 팀, 440여 명이 치열한 경합을 벌여서 더 라이트 벌브 팀과 조비스 팀, 이 두 팀이 최종 결승에 올랐는데요. 과연 최종 결승전에서는 어느 팀이 우승할지 기대가 됩니다. 먼저 대회 중계에 앞서서 오늘 결승전 도움 말씀 주실 분 소개해드리겠습니다. 한국외국어대학교 통번역대학원 정철자 교수님 나오셨습니다. 어서 오십시오.
네, 안녕하세요.
네, 자 올해로 이제 제5회째 맡고 있는 중학생 영어토론대회 어제부터 시작이 됐는데 아주 치열했죠?
예, 맞습니다. 사실 고등학생 대회보다 중학생 대회가 규모가 한 배, 이번에는 2배 이상 더 컸기 때문에 예선을 이틀에 걸쳐서 했어요. 그래서 어제, 그저께 해서 화수 예선전을 치르고요. 오늘 이제 본선을 했습니다. 예.
2주 전에 이 고등학교 영어토론대회 중계를 보신 분들은 좀 대략 아시겠지만 이 중학생 영어토론대회는 어떤 대회인지 좀 설명을 해주시겠어요?
예, 사실 중학생 영어토론대회도 기본 취지는 고등학생 영어대회와 마찬가지입니다. 궁극적으로는 영어가 세계 공용어이기 때문에 영어로 어디에 나가서든 논리적인 그 자기 주장을 할 수 있고 또 상대방을 존중하면서 공정한 어떤 그런 토론을 해갈 수 있는 진정한 어떤 그런 글로벌 리더를 우리가 길러보자 하는 것이 그 취지인데요. 고등학생 대회와 연계가 되어 있기 때문에 이 토론 능력을 좀 더 단계적으로 발전시켜 나갈 수 있는 어떤 틀을 저희가 만들고자 하는 게 취지입니다.
그렇군요. 근데 예년 대회하고 조금 다른 점이 있다고 들었어요? 올해 대회에서?
예. 올해 뭐 좀 몇 가지 변화가 있긴 한데요. 가장 중요한 변화는 저희가 올해부터 문호를 좀 더 개방했어요. 무슨 말씀이냐면 지금까지는 국내 중고등학생 대상으로 저희가 대회를 개최했었는데 올해부터 해외 중고등학생도 참가를 할 수 있도록 문호를 개방했습니다. 그게 이제 가장 큰 변화라고 할 수가 있습니다.
그렇군요. 자, 오늘 이 결승전에 오른 두 팀도 좀 소개를 해 주실까요?
예. 지금 아까 그 말씀하셨던 것처럼 The Light Bulbs 팀하고 조비스 팀이 올라와 있는데요. 지금 예선 성적을 보면 두 팀 다 아주 그 우수한 성적으로 그 올라왔는데 방금 말씀드렸던 것처럼 우리가 해외에 문호를 개방해서 어떻게 보면은 해외 학생들도 자유롭게 저희 대회에 이제 참가할 수 있게 된다면 그만큼 더 국제화된 그런 성격을 띈다고 할 수가 있는데요. 이 조비스 팀 지금 구성이 그렇게 되어 있습니다.
그렇군요.
예, 국내 중학생 2명과 해외에서 온 학생 1명으로 지금 혼합팀으로 구성이 돼서 이 팀이 우승까지 지금 바라볼 수 있는 그 장까지 올라갔네요.
아, 그렇군요. 정말 그 쟁쟁한 실력들을 뚫고 결승전까지 올라오게 됐는데 결승전 주제는 어떤 주제인가요?
예, 이번 그 중학생 대회 결승전 그 주제는 과학자들이 연구를 할 때 어떤 분류 기준으로 인종을 채택을 해서는 안 된다 하는 게 지금 결승 주제로 되어 있습니다.
예. 자, 이 주제를 놓고 과연 어떤 식으로 이제 경기가 펼쳐질지도 많이들 궁금해하실 것 같아요. 경기 방식도 좀 소개를 해주실까요?
예, 저희 그 고등학생 대회도 마찬가지입니다만 중학생 이 영어 토론은 예선전에서는 5회가 예선전으로 되어 있는데요. 승패와 상관없이 모두 다 5회전을 해야 합니다. 그래서 우리 팀 같은 경우는 4번 졌기 때문에 뭐 더 이상 할 필요가 있겠는가 해도 예외 없이 모든 팀이 5회 예선을 하고 난 다음에 그 5회 예선의 성적을 다 이제 합산을 해서 본선 진출자가 결정이 되고요. 본선에 진출한 팀들은 토너먼트 형식으로 그때부터는 이제 16강부터 시작을 하는데요. 토론을 벌이고 거기서 패하는 팀은 바로 이제 거기서 종료가 되는 거죠.
그렇군요.
토너먼트 방식, 본선은 토너먼트 방식으로 진행이 됩니다.
결승전은 두 팀이 어떤 식으로 이렇게 경합을 벌이게 되나요?
결선 같은 경우는 지금 이제 찬성과 반대로 팀이 결정이 되면은 주제를 놓고 각각 3명의 그 토론자들이 참석을 하게 되는데요. 첫 번째 그 토론자가 일단 찬성팀에서 먼저 나와서 이 주제에 대한 정의를 먼저 내리게 됩니다. 그래서 우리 팀에서는 이런 그 범위 내에서 이 토론을 이끌어 나가겠다라고 하면 이제 거기서부터 시작을 해서 반대팀의 첫 번째 의사가 반격을 하고 그것을 받아서 두 번째, 세 번째 넘어가는 이런 방식으로 진행이 되어 있는 것이죠.
그렇군요. 자, 이제 곧 대회가 시작이 될 것 같은데요. 현장 한번 연결해 보도록 하겠습니다.
government team, would you, yes.
지금 이제 두 팀을 소개하고 있는데요. 이 찬성이냐 반대냐는 현장에서 즉석에서
예,
결정이 되는
맞습니다.
거죠?
예, 동전 던지기를 해서 결정을 합니다.
그렇군요. 그러면 학생들도 내가 찬성팀이 될지 반대팀이 될지 모르니까 거기에 대한 대비들을 좀 다 양쪽 다 준비를 해야 되겠군요.
예, 지금 결승전 같은 경우는 주제가 미리 공지가 되는 준비 토론이에요.
예.
그렇기 때문에 아마 한 달 전에 공지가 됐기 때문에 두 팀 모두 이 주제를 가지고 준비를 했을 걸로 생각을 하는데요. 그러니까 우리 팀이 찬성을 할 거야, 우리는 찬성만 준비할 거야 이렇게 할 수 없죠. 그러니까 양쪽 입장에 모두 서서
네.
준비를 아마 철저하게 했을 겁니다.
지금 이제 심사위원들을 소개를 하고 있는 것 같은데요. 심사위원들은 어떻게 구성이 되나요?
예, 올해 지금 중학생 팀이 한 150팀 정도 들어갔으니까
네.
저희가 운용한 그 심판 수만 해도 75명 정도가 넘는데요. 근데 예선전 그 5번 그리고 지금 결승을 남기고 본선에서 3회를 하는데요. 매회 이 토론을 할 때마다 토론자들이 이 심판에 대해서 점수를 매깁니다. 그래서 점수가 가장 좋은 심판만 저희가 결승에 올리게 됩니다.
결승전 심판은 그럼 모두 몇 명으로 구성이 되는 거죠?
9명으로 구성이 됩니다.
9명이군요.
예.
9명이 각각의 그 항목에 따라서 이제 채점을 하고
그렇습니다.
그 점수를
나중에,
합산해서
예. 최종 우승을
가리게 되는 거군요. 예. 자, 이제 경기 시작을 앞두고 있는데요. 먼저 첫 번째 토론 주자로 나선 찬성팀의 주장을 먼저 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
It's about the societal impact of science and the risk that comes with it. We think that the fact is science cannot be extrapolated from the environment in which it operates in. And with that analysis, the proposition team will prove to you that first, race is an invalid and unjust scientific category. And second, that scientific research is being used to justify stereotypes. And third, the results could be incentives for discrimination in profit-seeking sectors. So with that, on to the first arguments of our case. Before we go on to the first arguments, on to our policy. First, the scientists should disengage from the efforts to prove biological, behavioral, or psychological underpinnings of race. And to be clear, that means that they shouldn't engage in research that relates the two. They shouldn't use race as a method of categorizing test subjects. They shouldn't investigate hypotheses related to race, and they shouldn't publish results based on a differentiation of the races. And second, to be clear, what we don't believe is that social scientists, such as anthropologists, shouldn't be allowed to comment on the social construction of the concept of race. We obviously think that race as a social construct does exist, but we think that any hard science efforts that attempt to prove the biological underpinnings of that race ought to be distinguished from immediately. So with that, on to the first two arguments of the proposition case. First, that race is an obsolete, inaccurate method of scientific categorization, and second, why the use of race as a category enables bigotry and racism unacceptable in our modern world. So on to our first argument about how race is an obsolete category. According to Craig Venter, the brain and leader behind the Human Genome Project, the Human Genome Project itself proves that race isn't a valid genetic category. But we'll explain this to you in 3 levels of analysis. First, that almost all human variation exists inside a population, not between. It's true because if you look at lands like Africa, it contains 90% of all human variation within the population, not between races. So what this means is that significant genetic differences are not between races, but inside. But second, there's also no pure race anymore because there no longer exists the concept of a race. There's no longer a race of African Americans or a race of Caucasian because with international, interracial interaction and marriages having existed for a significant amount of time and ever more increasing, we don't think that there's a concept of this divided race anymore. And what that leads to is first that it's unjust to have this as a scientific distinction, but second that these people, the scientists are going to be testing as black or Asian, aren't actually 100% black or Asian. That also leads to inaccurate scientific results. And lastly, and most importantly, that there's no way to extrapolate the biological results from the social and environmental factors. Why? Because in history, there's been a plethora of research that suggests or claims that African Americans have a higher rate of crime, or on average have a lower rate of IQ. The fact is, and the problem is, that it is ultimately impossible to distinguish whether that is something scientific, genetic, a biological difference, or a social categorization in which different environments force them to react differently. Yes, ma'am.
These researchers are never going to be disproved under your model, and which aggravates the stereotype you talked about.
We think that, okay, first you have to prove to us, as we will explain in our second argument, how in this society we're actually going to have this groundbreaking research. And second, the fact that these people who are looking at your groundbreaking research is going to take it and and take it in the same way as they will in research that suggests equally, which nicely leads actually on to my second argument about why the use of race as a category itself enables bigotry and racism unacceptable in the modern world. And we think that this is where we address the POI. We think that there's a risk that is going to be used for racism and bigotry, and that risk is something that we are not willing to take. First, we think that science as an industry cannot be extrapolated from the environment in which it operates in. So we ask three questions. First, who is doing this research? Second, who is funding it? And third, how is it likely to be interpreted?
Ma'am.
First, who is doing this research? Science and industry is essentially dominated by Anglo-Saxon ideals. The percentage of minority in the scientific field is extremely minimal, and incentives to release this research, but not only have hypotheses that in fact majority races are lower in some cases, or minority races are better than these majority races in certain cases, is unlikely. But second, who's funding this research? It's going to be big pharmaceutical companies and other profit-driven institutions. Because results are logically, it's going to be used in methods that benefit the majority for their profitable gain. And that is going to be extended by my Deputy Prime Minister. But thirdly, how is it likely to be interpreted? And this is the important question. Because people view scientific research with the same lens that they view the rest of society with. And why is this important? Because the impact of research is also dependent on their social lens in which they already look through society with. So consider the scenario in which you have a Caucasian person, a racist Caucasian individual. There's two results announced. First, that Asians, Hispanics, or African Americans, these minority races that they already discriminate against, are superior in a certain aspect. Second, another study that says, yes, you are right in that you are superior to those races. The question is how that racist person is going to take those results. We think that in these two results are going to be taken to different degrees. Because the impact is that with a social lens, the equal interpretation of results is impossible. And even if you're not racist, we unconsciously have stereotypes within us. And that's going to affect the social lens in which we view the scientific research with. But even if you are completely free of all of these stereotypes, it is natural to think of ourselves or us as an individual as better or superior, or at least not inferior. And we think that when this social lens exists, the concept of using scientific research to break racism, to shatter these stereotypes, and to use it for equality is impossible. Because after examination of the operation of science in our society, the proposition takes this debate we are proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Now, I'd like to call upon the first speaker from the opposition team. Leader of the opposition, please come to the podium.
Mr. and Madam Chair, on-site opposition, we strongly support the freedom of science. Scientists are not politicians and should not be held to political correctness. If a scientist is wrong, then let other scientists disprove it, Mr. Speaker, because we believe the politician interfering in science will lead to more bias and less knowledge in society. While we agree with the government side that race can be subjective and it is often difficult to define, we think as long as there are any possibility of benefits, scientists should be able to use it. In opposition, we will show you the many possibilities of benefit that will justify using this category. But before we go into arguments, firstly, I'd like to rebut to several points that the Prime Minister has told us. Firstly, Madam Speaker and Mrs. Speaker, they talked about how this should not be a category in the first place. But we believe that no, science uses only one variable in research, study. Along with race, they use things like age, gender, etc. So the implication isn't always racial, even if they use it. So Madam Speaker, Mr. and Madam Speaker, as we're going to also prove in our second argument, we believe that this is not the only implication that we use, which also follows their justification. But also they talked about how there's a very, very similarity between a lot of human races. But we believe that these small differences, these small percentage can actually make a lot of difference. And we believe that even though we don't actually have those studies in the status quo, that does not mean that research stops. We believe the science should be about fact-finding, always finding about the fact. And we believe that they're actually shutting those people up just because of this justification. But also rebutting to their note, thank you, ma'am, about their arguments about firstly, they talked about how there is a risk of perpetuating racism. But for responses, perpetuate racism. But Madam Speaker, firstly, we believe that science is never good or bad. It's not a science that is never good or bad. We believe that what is good or bad is the people who abuse science. We believe that in that person, we believe that we should not actually have these categories, because using a category itself means that we expand the realm of our knowledge about what we know about science. So we believe that in the first week, that's not a justification of going over and having this category. But secondly, Madam Speaker, they also talked about the pharmaceutical companies, how they're going to abuse it and make it on their own beneficial ways. But Madam Speaker and Mrs. Speaker, we don't think that that's the problem of our policy. We believe that that's the problem of them using it, those companies using it in another way. So we believe that even under their policy, they can never solve that problem. Also, we believe that they're actually aggravating that problem by shutting those people up, by shutting all of those researchers that can actually disprove these actions. We believe that which is crucial in society, to have a lot of opinions, to checks and balance other opinions, and that is why we believe that science is about knowing more. No, thank you, ma'am, sit down. We believe that that is what about science, and their justification do not stand. And that is why we see that their points all fall to this point, now going on to arguments. Directly, Madam Speaker, going on to arguments, so firstly, why is race as a categorization still an effective and a valiant method of classification in contemporary science? The first reason why, no thank you ma'am, we think it is useful is because there's a broad genetic variations across and between different races. The researchers have found the delineation of genetic clusters by racial group and racial specificity of rare genetic variants. In other words, different races vary substantially in terms of propensity of particular genes, frequency of variant alleles, and the frequency of phenotypes leading to, thank you ma'am, research does show that the gene is necessarily exclusive to any particular race, but we believe that current research does show that different races as a group have different genetic clusters in terms of propensity. In consequence, such different render it necessary to classify people according to different races and conduct studies based on that. But the second and more important reason why, no, thank you ma'am, about why we think scientists should be able to use race as a category is because these studies have helped and continue to help scientists contribute to the well-being of our citizens of different races, such as in the field of medicine. Among the millions of examples we can give you, no, thank you ma'am, sit down, we will let us introduce you three, and we believe that these benefits will justify and also break down their harms and the justification that they gave us. So through the race categorization, Mr. Amada Speaker, for example, we found that the Mendelian disorders are more likely to be found in French-Canadian populations compared to Black Canadians, therefore allowing doctors to make preventive measures and tailor medicine that will work better for these groups. Through race categorization, scientists also found out that the Tay-Sachs was a genetic disease with increased prevalence among Ashkenazi Jews, which therefore the Jewish communities early on welcomed genetic testing for prospective parents by doing so dramatically reduce the incidence of the disease. Also, medical studies based on race, no thank you ma'am, about race categorization also made it possible to discover that the African Americans with congestive heart failure actually made it respond to less effectively to the conventional CHF treatments compared to the white Caucasians, and that is why in 2005, Mr. Amada Speaker, the Food and Drug Administration actually authorized the sale of first race-based drug called Rebuttals. It was prescribed as a treatment for heart failure in African Americans and has now won the support of many other scientists. So we believe that along these, no thank you ma'am, why many scientists along the Association of Black Cardiologists. Why? It's because it reduced death rates from heart attacks by staggering to 44% within African American populations. If it weren't categorizing people, Mr. Amada Speaker, according to races, these important medical discoveries might not have been happened. Such findings clearly show that different races have different variations in disease risk, disease categorizations, progression, treatment response, and treatment-related side effects. And through race categorization, scientists and doctors can make important discoveries to which races can benefit from. So we believe that unless they actually disprove our benefits, their justification falls. But two, then does the ambiguity in race as a classification means scientists should not use it in their studies? We believe that we say this should not be a reason to not use it. Why? It's because you're not only categorized by your race, but most scientists also look into your background, age, gender, diet, etc., and a wide variety of factors that may influence you. So they do not use race alone, but use race as a supplement or simply another category among many other categories, and they take into consideration. But having race as an additional attribute helps, and that is why Mr. Amada Speaker, when race as a categorization alone may fail to capture the entire picture, this rarely happens because scientists will use other categories and factors together when conducting their studies, rendering science clearer and objective. So Mr. Amada Speaker, we want you to keep in mind that the harms that they talked about is going to be already disproved by and we're going to make a better society of having a discourse and a checks and balance between researchers. And we already gave you this clear and objective benefits that we're going to gain. And that is why we say that we strongly oppose this motion. Thank you.
첫 번째 토론 찬성과 반대 두 팀의 의견 어떻게 보셨나요?
Thank you, leader of the opposition.
찬성팀에서는 이 인종이라는 것을 분류 기준으로 하면서 오히려 어떤 특정 인종을 특정 유형으로 고착시키는 그런 효과가 있고 그게 결국은 사회적으로 부정적으로 사용될 수 있다라는
네.
주장인데 반해서 이 지금 반대팀에서는 과학자가 뭔가 잘못 발견했다면 그걸 검증하는 거는
Ladies and
뭐
gentlemen,
사회나
let's be
정치가
clear.
아니라
The fact
또 다른
is that
과학자가
when
할 수 있는
scientists
거
find a
제대로
certain
하게
gene that is
해줘야
only
한다는
present
그런
in a single race,
주장입니다.
which by
자,
the
두
way,
번째
there is no
토론
such thing as race,
들어보도록
as we've already
하겠습니다.
proven to you, we say that it's impossible to know with certainty what that gene causes because that's the difference between soft science and hard science, ladies and gentlemen. To be clear, we team proposition already have told you that we are differentiating between soft sciences and hard sciences. So if for any reason soft science wants to say that environmental factors make African Americans more likely to grow up as criminals, we say yes, we support that soft science. However, we do not support the hard science. The actual gene leads to this because it's actually impossible. We think that means that it harms the credibility of science, as we're going to go further into our rebuttals, because they furthermore did not rebut our argument on how social and environmental factors are impossible to distinguish. We demand an answer, which moves us on to our main rebuttals in today's debate. What did we hear from team opposition? They told you two arguments. First of all, on how it's ineffective, and second of all, on how it actually helps the minorities. We're going to rebut these thoroughly. First of all, they told us that, quote unquote, scientists we can disprove the scientists if scientists use wrong research. Well, number one, we say that people have social subconscious lenses, and that's why even in the past when evidence showing that African Americans were indeed more superior came out, we think that the reason that the research that said that Caucasians were more superior was able to flourish more was because people looked at the evidence through the subconscious social lens in which they already viewed society. We think that just uses science to justify racism, increase bigotry. We don't think that's a benefit. But second of all, we ask you, where did the scientists get the majority of their funding? We say, number one, they get the majority of their funding from mostly white scientist groups. And we say that those groups have no incentive to try to make sure that the scientists publish studies that say that African Americans are superior. We think that's another reason, but we also say that the majority of scientists are also white, so we don't think that their policy that scientists will somehow not be wrong is correct. But moving on to our main rebuttals, but before I move on, yes, ma'am.
Talking about your example about racism, that was in the past, the racism will peak. When it comes to these situations, there are other reasons to actually disprove these reasons. Can you actually disprove on that
We
point?
already gave you that in our first argument in 4 subpoints. We told you why, number one, that race exists in the population. We told you there's no pure race. We told you that they merge and it's arbitrary. And we told you that social and environmental factors. That's exactly why Biddle, the heart medicine drug that they've been flouting so much, actually didn't work because the distinction was so arbitrary that actually worked the same on Caucasians as African Americans. That's the harm on their side. But moving on to our main arguments their main arguments of number one, ineffectiveness. We already told you about the social environmental factors that we don't think they got a clear response. But they also talk about quote unquote French people and getting more Tay-Sachs and certain races being more likely to get Tay-Sachs. Number one, we like to point out that if somebody's half French and half Jewish, that the doctor will be very confused about that. Second of all, we say that actually not only the confusion, but that makes the doctor, if the doctor is not sure about what the patient is having, we say that he's going to give the French test or a Jew test. We think these kinds of things make the medical diagnostic much more inefficient and doesn't personalize it to one person. I was going to extend in my third argument. But furthermore, we say that Biddle was actually criticized for not just helping African Americans, but also helping Caucasians that's the same way because the distinction is so arbitrary. Moving on to our main arguments, we told you that race is obsolete and inaccurate. The only rebuttal they gave you was that there's quote unquote a pure race. We say that there's actually not a pure race. We think that there's a difference between causation and correlation. We think that the majority of the reasons why African Americans, for example, get more certain kinds of diseases like heart failure is because of the socio-economic status in which they grow up in, which is for soft sciences to decide, not their ridiculous policies. But second of all, onto when we talked about how it's unacceptable that it enables bigotry. We told you that these results, even if the results are the same, they are going to be interpreted differently. We see no clear response to that other than that quote unquote people will use science well, which I'm going to rebut into my third argument. But furthermore, they also talk about how quote unquote we also talked about how the lenses in which people see these are very different. We demand an answer to that as well. But moving on to our third argument, I'm going to talk about the harms to the quality of science. I'm going to bring 2 subpoints: diagnostics and on the credibility of science. First of all, on diagnostics, we say that human diversity means that all kinds of different humans are different, and we say that doctors are going to be handicapped by race under their policy because it's way too easy for an African American to go into the doctor's clinic, and when the doctor doesn't understand what disease that African American is suffering from, it's way too easy for him to say, oh, you're suffering from Tay-Sachs or you're suffering from sickle cell anemia. We don't think that, for example, I'm more likely to have prostate cancer because I'm a man. Doesn't mean that that the doctor should ignore certain things like personal genetics or backgrounds, and we don't think we're the ones who make better medical practices for minorities. But furthermore, we say that medicine is not objective. Let's get to the point, because we say that pharmaceutical companies want to make money. They don't make medicine for humanitarian purposes, and it is exactly that, because you see that in status quo, medicines for minorities are much less in quantity than medicine for majorities. We say that the reason for this is because when you target a certain group, you see that medicine, because it's to save somebody's life, shouldn't be targeted to a certain group because you can influence it. We already see this when people are trying to make ethnic weapons by targeting a certain gene. We don't think that's a good thing at all. But we also say that government-funded research is fueling racism. We see that especially bad when science is not only fueling racism, but when government-funded research is fueling racism. We think that the government has a fundamental obligation to protect the minorities from the tyranny of the majority. We think that their side makes sure that the minorities are oppressed by government-funded research. We would rather the government make sure that we stop this immediately. Moving on to our second subpoint of the credibility of science, I'm going to talk about correlation versus causation. We think that the lack of credibility is harming science because the trend in science is moving away from causation to correlation, which we believe is meant for the soft sciences. We demand an answer to that. But second of all, we talk about the opportunity cost, because we say that there's a limit to how much you can find upon race. We would rather use the money dedicated toward race to finding more pressing issues, like making sure that we stop global climate change. We think that the money can be spent in better ways. And for all those reasons, we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
과학자들이 인종을 분류 기준으로 삼지 말아야 한다에 찬성하는 팀의 두 번째 주장 어떻게 보셨나요?
Thank you.
네, 지금
Deputy Prime
이
Minister.
팀에서는
Now, I'd like
아까
to
이 팀에서
invite Deputy
영리를
Leader of the
추구하는
Opposition to the
기업들이
podium.
이런 과학 결과를 잘못 오용할 수 있다는
네.
거에 대해서 반대팀에서 그거는 기업 자체를 컨트롤해야지 과학 결과에 대해서
네.
이야기를 해서는 안 된다라고 반대한 거에 대해서 다시 이제 반론을 제기한 것이
네.
그럼에도 불구하고
네.
여전히 이 사회적으로 그것이 오용될 위험이 있다는 걸 지금 이제 찬성팀에서는 주장을 했는데요.
네.
이 백그라운드 연구를 굉장히 많이 한 게 보이네요. 지금 이 찬성팀에서는 과학이라고 해서 그냥 천편일률적으로 모든 과학이 아니라 소프트 사이언스, 하드 사이언스라고 구분을 해서 물론 그 인종을 분류 기준으로 삼아야 되는 게 있지만 삼지 말아야 하는 것도 있다라고 해서 굉장히 지금 미묘한 부분까지 세분화해서 들어가고 있네요.
네, 자 여기에 반대하는 팀의 두 번째 주장 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
So ladies and gentlemen, today the proposition talked about a genome project and how we know about genetics because of this. But are you sure, proposition, that what you know now will be what you also know in the future? And are you arrogant enough that you think you know all about genetics, that you can say race isn't part of genes or science? We think that the answer is no. We think that we can always make discoveries. We think that we can always make discoveries, and we do always make discoveries from these stupid questions that these people think that is irrational or something. We think that the role of science is not to restrict it. We think that we should allow science in order to make more discoveries based on that. So we think that we can never prove a negative that race isn't a part of genes. We think that we should rather allow genes to be researched so that we can find more results about race if it's a genetic factor or not, Mr. Madam Speaker. So we think that all of their points, which were about how race shouldn't be used as a genetic factor, falls due to this. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are not racist and we abhor racism. But let's not choose to be very, very ignorant. Millions of people identify themselves by their race, and even if it's not all of who you are, it is a part of who you are. And the role of scientists should be to encourage a knowledge-based society that as long as you can prove what you say, and then you should say it. So if I am wrong, let another scientist disprove me. And after all, that's what we do as debaters. These teams disprove us and our team disproves them. We think that the same process can happen in science, Mr. Madam Speaker. So as the second speaker of the opposition bench, I will show you how race-based categories can help develop effective government policy. But before going on to our team's argument, let me rebut to the previous speaker. Well, first of all, they talked about how they support soft science. Well, then they're compromising their own principles because their principles was about how this might perpetuate racism.
but we think that when they also allow softer stance, we think that then that is compromising their own principle and actually a contradiction. And then they talked about how we can't distinguish between social and environmental factors, and it's very, very impossible to distinguish between this and race. And sometimes, Mr. and Madam Speaker, you need a lot of categories in order to look at the problem from diverse perspectives. So it might be your background, or it might be your environmental factor that may cause the disease, but it may be your race that can be the variable and have the higher propensity to cause these kind of diseases. So we think that just because you live in the same region, we think that it doesn't mean that you can always have the disease. Maybe it can be a race, and we think that race should be used as a category if the scientist really, really wants to, Mr. and Madam Speaker. And then they talked about how we use science to justify racism, and we think that this was the main harm that they talked about. So we think that racism caused facts to be looked at in a certain way, but facts never cause racism, Mr. and Madam Speaker. So that is why it is scientific to call differences between gender, how women are actually able to have babies while men don't. We think that when sexism and sexists look at this in a different way, in an inferior way, we think that these sexists might say that women are inferior because they have babies, and this might cause them an inability to work compared to men. But we think that just because of that, we never ban research based on sex. We think that just because there is sexism, that is a problem for the government and governmental policies to solve, not science. We think that we support science based on everything, but we think that the problem is not about science itself, it is about the people who use them. So that is why we never ban people from developing nuclear weapons or microwaves, because microwaves might be used as a human weapon when we think about it also, Mr. Madam Speaker. But secondly, we think that this actually harms our attempts to disprove racism by itself, because we think that we like the situation now, because there won't be any perpetuation of racism, or we won't be solving racism both sides. But we think that in the status quo, in our policy, we have people who try to disprove racism and who try to support racism too. We think that there is a healthy discourse between these people so that people can realize what kind of differences do these people have, Mr. and Madam Speaker. And we think that this is actually very, very beneficial. And we think that they talked about how we are very, very confused about what race you are in. So if I'm more closer to black or Caucasian or white, we think that I might have more possibilities of getting that disease. And that's what we do in medical science field today, Mr. and Madam Speaker. So we don't think that is really a problem. And then they talked about how doctors will always use these race as an only category. So Mr. and Madam Speaker, we always trust doctors to make best decisions based on generalization. So for example, we say that certain genders, like women, are more prone to live longer than men. And doctors make decisions based on that. We think that we trust them to make rational decisions based on those generalizations that we have in the status quo, Mr. and Madam Speaker. So we always trust doctors to make decisions based on generalization. So we think that these points are not really exclusive to the opposition side. So moving on to the argument. So how can race categorization lead to practical benefits in society? So now our leader of opposition has already explained the health-related benefits, but let's go further. So firstly, we think that race as a categorization allows the government to direct more capital and resources and alleviating problems for certain groups. For example, many studies show that African Americans have higher rates of cancer and heart disease, and as such, race categorizations help identify the disparities between health and medical care different racial groups have between others. And by identifying racial differences, regardless of whether it is genetic or not, it allows the state to direct more resources and capital towards racial groups that need additional support. So the second thing we would say is that race categorization helps expose racist and racist policies. So we all agree that there are great achievement gaps, and if it's not genetic, then there must be a societal or racist factors. So scientists or policymakers that insist on using race to prove things that cannot be proved or refuse to respect the evidence are therefore exposed as racist. So this is what proper scientific approach is like. So allowing scientists to use whatever category that they want, because we know rigorous debate will follow. And this is the type of society we want to create, one that encourages debate but not suppresses it. So Mr. and Madam Speaker, we're very, very proud to oppose.
네, 반대팀 김민영 학생의 주장 들어보셨습니다. 어떻게 보셨나요?
예, 지금 이
Now I'd
팀에서는
like to invite
어떻게
the third
인종이
speaker from the
앞으로도 계속 변해갈 텐데 왜 연구를 안 한다는
Please come to the
말이냐. 유전자 연구에서 인종이라는 것이 얼마나 중요한 요인인데 그것을 연구하지 않겠다고 하느냐 하는 걸로 반격을 강하게 나왔네요.
네.
그래서 지금 찬성 쪽에서는 인종차별주의의 근원이 되기 때문에 인종을 분류 기준으로 삼아서는 안 된다 하는데 지금
네.
이쪽에서는 오히려 객관적으로 연구함으로 해서 인종차별주의의 어떤 그런 요인을 없앨 수 있을 것이다라고
예.
하는
The
거죠.
opposition team today,
자,
they don't
찬성팀의 주장,
rebut to
반대의
us
주장
on any of our
들어보겠습니다.
arguments that we provide you today in our debates. They simply ignore the government case and go on to talk about what they want to talk about. And when we've already provided with the rebuttals, when we've already provided with you on how what they're doing doesn't really work, how what they're doing is only going to lead to exploitations in medical areas, how it's going to only lead to increased racism, how there is no justifications on a category when it comes to race as a category of science, right? But we say they simply ignore these rebuttals and just go on to say, well, we seem right and we're going to go with it, but we're not going to listen to the government team. We say that's the stance that opposition team is taking today, but we say the government team actually addresses the matter fully and is able to take this debate home today. But to prove to you actually on how we actually engage and win this debate today, I have three clashes. First, is race something that can be justified as a category in science? And second, does having race as a category actually solve racism, even if race is not justified as a category? And lastly, what kind of inherent harms result from using race as a category, right? Now let's move on straight to my first clash, and I'll rebut what their third arguments within my clashes, right? Now let's move on to how is there justification. Now our prime ministers already come up to you and told us, already set up how there is no such thing as pure race, right? And how how race is not only something biological, but something that involves environmental and sociological effects as well. Why do you think that race is something that is only biological?
How do you know that there's no pure science? How do you know that just because there's no
Ladies
pure
and
blood,
gentlemen, we
then there's
see
no
African
differentiation?
Americans living in a poor condition right now. They're living in an inherently poor, unstable condition where they don't really have sustainable water. Where they don't really have healthy foods. Ladies and gentlemen, that is inherently harmful for them. It's not something that they're genetically born with, that they don't have any food to live with, or they have unhealthy food. It's something that is sociological. We say that can't be considered as something biological. We say that's inherently wrong. We say that's exactly why the opposition team loses on this debate today. They simply ignore our justifications for why it's not simply biological. They don't engage in this facts. And we tell you how when it's not justified, we say it leads to inaccurate results. We tell you because it's not only they simply focus on the biological aspects, but in fact, when there are not all biological effects, it leads to inaccurate results. And that's why we tell you that we cannot use race as a category in science. But they also don't rebut to us on the fact about how there is social lens that is inherent as well, right? We don't see any engagement with this. They simply say that facts aren't bad, people are. Then we say that she actually concedes that one, there are racists, and two, that she doesn't really engage with our second argument on social lens anyways. We say they're really showing no logic at all. But they also talk about how, we should be allowing these because they have the freedom of science, and how we should be letting science disprove it. We've already told you a case how science has already disproved by having the Human Genome Project. They simply ignore this fact. They tell us, let science disprove it, and we've disproved it to you. Why can't we stop using science as race as a category? Ladies and gentlemen, we see no justification. We can't let freedom when it's hard science, when people actually believe in these results, when we can't actually really believe in when actually race is not a justified category. We can't let this happen. We say it's inherently bad for our society, and that's why we say race can't be used as a justification. By having proved you the justifications of how race is something that is not justified as a category because it contains sociological and environmental harms as well, we say that we've already won this debate. But let's move on to the even if cases, right? Let's take a look at the harms, even if race could be used as a category, how race shouldn't be used. Let's move on to our second clash. Now, let's talk about having race actually beneficial for the racism, solving racism, because the opposition team simply tells us that, by having race as a category, we're able to disprove racism. Well, we say they're actually they haven't engaged with our first two arguments on how there is no legitimacy because because we're discriminating, we tell you how the scientists and the funders don't have any incentive to actually have make policies that actually and have projects that are going to disprove racism. We tell you that they have no motivation, but they simply argue on a very ideological fact that they're simply going to, right? We say that's not the case that we see today. We don't see race disproving racism, right? But they also talk about how we have differences in women, right? But we say women and men are inherently different. We have biological differences. When it comes to race, however, they include other factors such as sociological and biological, which we say actually increases the racism as race. And that's why we say we don't really disprove racism. Now let's move on to our last clash, which is about what kind of inherent harms result from using race as a category, right? They simply tell us, well, government policy isn't going to be solving any of these harms anyway. But ladies and gentlemen, just telling us that it's not going to solve it doesn't justify how we don't really have any have harms. But we say we don't have these harms because we don't allow race to be a category. We say so that these exploitations that we've already clearly proven to you won't be happening. And so we say we actually don't have any benefits. And we say when it comes to the treatment of diseases, we've already clearly told you from our prime ministers and deputy prime ministers' speeches about how it's going to be exploited, how it's not very beneficial. We don't see any engagement. We see an opposition team who doesn't engage, who doesn't acknowledge the fact that race cannot be used as a category, whether or not it's justified, or not. And that's why we're proud to propose. Thank you.
찬성팀의 세 번째 연설자 김현지 학생의 논리는 어떤가요?
예, 지금 찬성의 세
Thank
번째
you,
연사는
Now
앞에서
I'd
나온
like to
내용들을
open the podium
요약하면서
to
동시에
the
또 어떤 그
opposition.
강력한 입장을 밝혀야 되는데요.
네.
지금 찬성팀에서는 그런 연구 결과가 결국은 사회적으로 오용될 것이다, 악용될 것이다. 그리고 이 인종 연구라는 것이 결국은 어떤 사회적인 환경적인 요인과 분리될 수가 없는데
네.
인종만 본다는 건 불합리하다는 점을 지금 요약해서 다시 한번 강조를 하고
그렇군요.
있어요.
네, 반대팀의 정유신 학생의 주장 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a dirty social lens, change that lens, ladies and gentlemen. You believe that just because you have a dirty lens, it doesn't mean that it's not worthy of actually seeing the society as it is in the factual society, ladies and gentlemen. You believe that regardless of how society utilizes it, scientists actually have a right to find out more about facts. We see this case in everyday society, ladies and gentlemen. Now in my speech, I'd like to prove the questions of this debate and now why the opposition has taken this debate home. First question is regarding the inaccuracy of race that they have stated. Well, there were three things that they've stated. Firstly, about this genome project and we believe that this is a very, very big miss because this was one of the two reasons that they have provided. We have three responses. Firstly, we believe that just because there was this genome project, it doesn't mean that it's always true, ladies and gentlemen. Just because there was one research that proved like how race has no relevance, it doesn't mean that it's factualized, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that if we have like a really lack of knowledge about these genetics, we believe that they cannot just declare that there is no relevance because we have such a lack of the knowledge about genetics, ladies and gentlemen. And secondly, we believe that you can never prove a negative, ladies and gentlemen. Just because you never found a certain correlation, it doesn't mean that the correlation does not exist, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that there is no, just because this is their justification, it doesn't justify anything. And thirdly, we believe that when there is genome project, there are also researches that support race, and they support that race correlation with race and these kind of genetic clusters, ladies and gentlemen. We gave examples of how race was used as one of the researches. We gave examples of Mendelian disorders, Tay-Sachs. However, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that these kind of things can happen. And also, they disprove this example of Biddle. We believe that the same thing can happen in society, ladies and gentlemen. If someone gives an example, they can disprove it, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that if these kinds of things happen, there are no harms that they have stated, such as racism. So we believe that their whole case was based on nobody disproving it and everybody accepting it, ladies and gentlemen. However, we believe that they have the burden to prove when actually people disprove it, what are the harms of our policy? Because we believe that if people disprove it, there wouldn't be harms, there wouldn't be racism, because there is a free discourse of the science, ladies and gentlemen. And secondly, what they stated was that there was this mixture. We have two responses. Firstly, mixture doesn't mean that we shouldn't use it, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we believe that even if there is a mixture, the fact that
that you find out more about a race means that you have the worthy to research more about it, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that you found that African Americans are more prone to disease, it means that you can find a fact more about these kind of things. You can find fact and a tendency for every other races, ladies and gentlemen. You believe that just because it's so complicated, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, ladies and gentlemen. You believe that this is a social consensus. And thirdly, we have stated about the practical benefits. However, they stated how like these kind of scientists actually think about like these racism. However, we believe that they're actually mischaracterizing these kind of scientists because we don't think that scientists are people who promote racism. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that if they promote racism, they get a lot of criticism from the public. We believe that scientists are people who try to prove the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that if there is a fact, it should come out to society. We don't know why they are trying to hide it. The second question is regarding racism. Firstly, they stated that they support a softer stance. We believe that racists can also use a softer stance, ladies and gentlemen. For example, if there is a softer stance that blacks are poor, or racists can say that they're poor because they are black, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that the same thing can happen in their softer stance. So what this proves is that they're not solving their own problem of racism, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that the same thing can happen when companies support these kind of researches. The same harms can happen, ladies and gentlemen. And secondly, we believe that but what this proves is that racists are racist no matter what. It's not the fault of these kind of facts. It's the fact that there is this vague notion of just hating behind their skin color. We don't know how these kind of facts actually like boost up racism. We don't know the linkage of this. And secondly, we believe that we believe that it would further aggravate racism because what we're saying is that what we're saying to these kinds of middle people who are not racist or people who are not racist, we believe that to these people we're saying we have something to hide behind our backs. We don't want this research to come out to society. We believe that what this proves is that there is something to hide. This aggravates their problem that they want to solve, ladies and gentlemen. But thirdly, a lot of race-based research is also done in good faith to disprove such stained racist logic, which is why you cannot conclude that this is always a bad thing, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, you ban such race categorizations, you also prevent research aimed at disproving these kind of things, the rhetoric against racism, from progressing as well, ladies and gentlemen. And thirdly, they stated how companies try to fuel these kinds of scientists, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that this is also a mischaracterization because most scientists start these kind of things because of curiosity, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that, and also, we believe that if that is a matter of companies, it's a matter for the companies to solve it. We have responded to this, but we don't know why, but the government didn't seem to catch it. And also, we believe that for blacks, companies actually try to, we believe that if we just block these kind of things, what happens is that companies that are racist actually try to revive these kind of thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. We believe the same things, same harms can happen under their policy. So we believe that the government was so busy about proving how racism would happen under our case that they lacked time to prove how racism would not happen in their case, ladies and gentlemen. We believe this is a very, very big fact, ladies and gentlemen. And also, we had stated how women and men are biological. We had stated how these kind of doctors can make a rational judgment. Well, but what they had stated is that they gave this generalization about gender. They stated that because one of the speakers is a boy, the doctor knows that they are more prone to these kind of cancer. Exactly, ladies and gentlemen. Because the doctors know that just because you are one gender and you're more prone to these kind of genders, the doctors do not give you a cancer medicine just because you are a boy, ladies and gentlemen. We believe the same thing can happen in this case. Just because you're black and just because you're more prone to black diseases, it doesn't mean that the doctors will be so irrational and just say that I'll give you this medicine. We believe that even if there are cases, because we're not only using race as a category, because you're using a lot of factors as a category, ladies and gentlemen, you believe that it is better to have more facts about these kind of things. You believe it doesn't harm doctors, it doesn't harm medication, so there is no harm to society if they can make these kind of process. And also they didn't engage to a point that science is not a bad fact of finding this process is always needed, ladies and gentlemen. This is because we never know what science could be, ladies and gentlemen, because even when it comes to mixed blood, we never know, ladies and gentlemen. So we have given you the parallel examples that we don't ban nuclear energy just because there is possibility of use. Possibility of use can never mean that government has justification to ban it. So this is why we're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
반대편의 세 번째 주장 평을 해주신다면요?
예, 지금 반대편에서는
Thank you,
찬성팀에서 어떤
Opposition
사회적인
Lead. Now I'd
효용에
like to
대해서
call
포커스를
upon
맞춰서 계속했다면
Opposition.
이쪽에서는 순수한 연구의 중요성을 지금
네.
강조를 하고 있잖아요. 그쪽으로 계속 이야기를 하면서 찬성 쪽에서 어떤 특정 사실 하나만으로 이런 인종 연구가 불필요하다라고 일반화하면 안 된다. 일반화의 어떤 그런 위험에 대해서 경고를 했고요. 재밌는 것은 지금 찬성팀에서 혼혈의 경우는 어떡하냐, 어느 인종으로 분류할 거냐라는 아까 결론을 제기했었는데 지금 이쪽 팀에서는 혼혈 그 자체가 또 하나의 어떤 중요한 연구 주제가 될 수 있는 것 아니냐라고
네.
지금 서로 주고받는 아주 강하게 지금
So,
주고받고
Mr.
있습니다.
Amano Speaker,
자,
do
마무리
we
토론
know
반대팀의
all about
주장부터
genetics like the
들어보겠습니다.
proposition states? No. Can you ever prove a negative statement? The answer is again no. So then how will you ever know that what you think of now, that race is not connected to genetics, will be what we know in the future, Mr. Amado Speaker? We think that when Einstein told people that time and space has a correlation, everybody told him that he was insane, that these had no correlation. But everything starts from these stupid questions or crazy questions that people think of. We think scientific discoveries always result from these kind of questions. So we think that we have actually a benefit in trying to make people also use race as a category. But we think that it is very, very dangerous stance for the proposition to take when they say that all races are the very, very same. We think that this is very, very dangerous stance to take when there might be a difference. It is also proven in the status quo that Mendelian disorders are more prone to French Canadians, Tay-Sachs is more prone to Ashkenazi Jews, and CHF treatments are more effective on white Caucasians than black African Americans, Mr. Amano Speaker. And when we never discover these facts, we would be never able to see if these people might have shorter lifespans due to these diseases, Mr. Amano Speaker. We think that is very, very dangerous stance to take when they do not really know what is same or what is different, Mr. Amano Speaker. So we think that it is not for our burden to say that race is always connected to genetics. We just think that we don't know enough yet if race is a genetic category or not. We know that racism is a social construct, but we don't know if race is a genetic category, a scientific category, or a social construct yet, Mr. Amano Speaker. And when this is not proven yet, we think that scientists should be able to discover it, scientists should be able to research on it so that we can have further knowledge and actually know if this is a category worth using or not. So their only harm that came from the proposition team, that this will perpetuate racism. So the government's logic was very, very simple. They said that this gives evidence to these racist people because we have these scientific discoveries. But Mr. Amano Speaker, first of all, they never proved to us how their policy is actually going to decrease the racism or make any change in the status quo. But we think that racists are racist not because of science, not because of evidence that we have. They just hate these people with certain skin color, whether it is because of science or not. So we think that, so does this research actually promote racism? We think that the answer is no, because we see no correlation between the science and perpetuating racism itself. But we think that difference is a difference. We think that when you say that these people are more prone to certain diseases, that is just a difference. But we think that when people like government interprets them as blacks or people being inferior, we think that that becomes a problem, and that is the problem for the government and the governmental policies to solve, Mr. Amano Speaker, not the problem of the science itself. We think that difference is just a difference. It doesn't mean that you're inferior. But secondly, what are they so afraid of when this perpetuates racism? We think that the core difference between proposition and opposition case today is that in proposition we don't have measures in order to disprove these kind of racist thoughts. We think that in our case we have these people who try to actively disprove these thoughts and actively try to disprove these racist beliefs, Mr. Amano Speaker. So we think that our policies is actually better in tackling these kind of issues, Mr. Amano Speaker. So Mr. Amano Speaker, we're very, very proud to oppose.
반대팀의 마무리 연설이었습니다. 교수님.
네. 지금 양쪽 팀 다 의학적인 그 연구에서 이 인종이라는 것이
Thank you,
찬성팀 같은 경우는 사회적인 환경적인 요소보다 중요하지 않다라고 하고 지금 이쪽에서는 특정 인종에서 더 많이 발병하는 병이 확실하게 있다. 그렇기 때문에 아직도 더 많이 연구되어야 한다는 주장을 다시 한번 강조를 하면서
네.
부적합하다는 게 100%
Let's be
검증되지
clear.
않은
The
상황에서는
average
연구가 돼야
scientist
된다는
isn't going to
것이죠.
publish
네,
a report that
찬성팀의
says
마무리 토론
African Americans and
들어보겠습니다.
Asians are stupid, they should be segregated, they should be killed, they should be burned at the stake. Ladies and gentlemen, the kind of research that will be published, however, are the ones that are subtle and harm us subconsciously and our moral values as a whole. And we think that's exactly why proposition side takes this debate. And I'm going to provide you two paths that you can take, Madam Speaker. You can either take government side's path of making sure that science is not used as a category, or opposition side stance. But before we move on, let's clear up a few issues. First of all, the stats versus stats debate. We told you that it's false that Biddle worked better for African Americans because there's such a little difference between race that actually the medicine can't even find it out. We think that this proves that the medicine as the medicine that was designed for African Americans works just as well in white Caucasians, we think that proves that there is no difference between race. We saw no engagement, and that's why we won the statistics. But second of all, our job isn't to prove that we solve racism, is to prove that racism is perpetuated by the hard science that was given in the past, and it's continuing to be given. We again saw no response. So moving into the path that government side and opposition side takes you, which side preserves science credibility? We told you that hard science would only be used when causation was clear, and we say that correlation would not be accepted under science, hard science. We think that's a good thing for science. But second of all, we say that under our model, science can be used to better research other things that are more pressing, like climate change. What do we see in our side opposition? They told you that African Americans are quote unquote more likely to be obese and have heart disease. Well, we see that's up to soft science to decide, because that's the kind of thing like sociology that should decide whether or not living poor makes sure that you're more fat and have more likely to be heart disease. It's important to say that this gene makes you dumb, this gene makes you fat. For example, furthermore, we say that science is extremely biased because we say that funders and scientists, for example, we already see this in real life situations. Can you imagine a conservative Cato Institute funded scientist saying that Obama is a great president? We say that's exactly the kind of stance that we already took. We told you that the funders will cut funding and fire scientists. Scientists want to keep their jobs. That's exactly why they're going to publish results against the minorities. But furthermore, we told you that we're going to stop bigotry under our model because the government has a fundamental duty to protect the minorities from the tyranny of the majority. We already told you that we're going to make sure that the medicine goes equally to everybody. We're going to make sure that the government doesn't fund hard science that's going to fuel racism and thereby decrease the government legitimacy. We ask whether or not the average redneck Texan white male would look at the study and go, quote unquote, look at the study that says that African Americans are smarter and say, oh, I guess I'm dumber than an African American. We think that that person would more likely look for the plethora of social evidence that would come up later on that says that actually Caucasians are more smarter than blacks. We think that that's the kind of reason why social lens went to our side, because we make sure that these white people just look for the plethora of evidence supporting their side and don't engage with the facts, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on, we make sure that scientific research is used to fund credible causes that actually prove causation. They're the ones who use government funds to fuel bigotry and continue the process of harms we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
찬성팀의
예.
마무리 연설까지 모두 끝났습니다.
예, 찬성팀에서는 그 의학
Okay, that
연구에서
concludes
인종
the
간
debate. It's a
차이가
wonderful match.
거의 의미가 없는
Debaters,
그런
please stand
또
up,
연구 결과가
please,
많이
and
있다는
across the
그
floor
사례를
as you can.
들면서
네.
반대팀을 지금 반격을 하고 있는데요. 결국은 인종처럼 아직까지 그 효용성이 정확하게 판명되지 않은 그런 분류 기준을 쓰기보다는
네.
뭐 기후 변화라든지
Alright,
더
you may go
중요한
back
그런 연구를
out
해야
to the floor and
된다라는
go back
건데요.
to sit.
그러니까 사회적인 효용성에 초점을 맞출 것이냐, 아니면 과학 연구의 어떤 그런 그 순수성 혹은 그 근본적인 목적, 거기에
네.
초점을 맞출 것이냐, 그 두 개를 가지고 지금 찬성팀과 반대팀이 토론을 했는데요. 지금 이번 토론에서 또 재밌었던 것은 찬성팀에서는 반대팀이 나와서 이야기할 때 손을 들고 계속
네네.
의견을 제시를 했잖아요.
예.
반대팀에서는 하나도 지금
그렇죠.
받지 않았고, 그 찬성팀에서 나와서 이야기할 때는 반대팀에서 손을 들었으면 그거를 받아줬잖아요. 전략적으로 보면
네.
반대팀에서 발언을 하고 있을 때 그렇게 의견을 내려고 하면 뭐 여러 번은 매번 받아주지는 않더라도
네.
한 번 정도는 받아주는 게 좋습니다.
안 그래도 저 그거 보면서 그게
네.
궁금했거든요. 저렇게
네.
상대팀에서 막 논리를 펼치고 있을 때 손을 들고 질문을 했을 때
네.
이걸 받아주고 안 받아주고라든지
네.
아니면 여기에 대해서 어떻게 답변하느냐가 승패의 좌우를
그
미칠까요?
사실
궁금했어요.
그 규정에
네.
반대팀이 의견을 제시할 때 모두 다 받아주어야 한다든지 그런 룰은 없어요.
네.
뭐 반대팀 같은 경우는 하나도 받지 않았잖아요.
네.
그 하나도 받지 않아도 좋지만 그것조차도 전부 지금 심판들은 판정을 할 때 반영을 합니다.
네.
그러니까 얼마나 좋은 질문을 하는가 하는 것도 보고요.
예.
그 질문에 대한 답이 얼마나 적절한가. 정말 토론을 잘하는 학생 같은 경우는 반대팀에서 나오는 질문을 이용을 해서
네.
오히려 자기 입장을 더 강화하는 쪽으로 쓸 수도 있거든요.
예.
그래서 질문을 받아서 얼마나 잘 효과적으로 쓰는가
네.
하는 것도 그 점수에 반영이 돼요. 근데
예.
뭐 반드시 몇 개 받아야 된다 이런 룰은 없지만 그냥 일반적으로 해서 적어도 한 개 정도는 받아주는 게 유리하죠. 그런데 이번 팀을 보면은 아마 반대팀은 우리 이 발표하는데 우리 의견을 개진하는데 이게 지금 좀 흐트러질 수 있으니까 받지 말자라고 합의를 하고 나왔는지 모르겠습니다. 재밌네요. 여기 이제 하나도 안 받고.
사실 이게 결승전 주제는 준비를 할 수 있는 시간이 있기 때문에
예,
자신들의 논리를 펼쳐 나가다가 상대팀이 어떤 돌발적인 질문을 받게 되면 이 논리가 흐트러질 수도 있잖아요.
그렇죠. 예, 쉽지 않습니다.
예.
사실 또 질문을 할 때는 목적이 지금 발언하는 사람을 도와주려고 질문하는 경우는 없거든요.
예.
사실은 좀 전략적으로 그 흐름을 좀 깨놓으려고
네.
좀 흐트리려고 하는 거기 때문에 받는 사람한테 그만큼 부담이 가는 거죠.
네,
부담이 가기는.
그렇군요. 2주 전에 고등학생 영어 토론대회 때도 우승팀을 교수님께서 정확하게 예상을 해주셨는데 오늘 찬성팀과 반대팀
정말 두
어느
팀은
쪽에 조금 더 점수를 주고 싶으세요?
정말 오늘 가늠하기 힘들 정도로
양쪽
두
다
팀이.
치열하게.
근데 이게 지금 과학 주제다 보니까 단순히 뭐 인종을 분류 기준으로 뭐 써야 한다, 말아야 한다라고 주장할 수가 없고
네.
이렇기 때문에 써야 한다, 이렇기 때문에 쓰지 말아야 한다고 이제 연구가 돼야 되는데
네.
지금 양쪽 팀 보면은 나름대로 의학 분야에서 이런 경우에는 인종 때문에 좋은 연구 결과가 있었고 또 이런 경우에는 인종이 어떤 변인이 됐지만 그게 아무런 의미가 없었다. 나름대로 자기들 그 논지에 적합한
네.
그런 그 연구를 많이 한 게 보이네요. 네.
그렇군요. 자, 이제 어느 정도
막상막하인 것
심사가
같습니다.
끝난 것 같은데요.
네.
자, 현장으로 가보도록 하겠습니다. 한국외국어대학교 애경홀로 가보겠습니다.
All right.
자, 이제
The
우승을
winner
발표할 차례인데요.
of the grand finals of the 5th Ytn host Junior Youth English Debating Championship is, it's very close, 5-4 decision. Oh, the winner is the light bulbs.
네. 서울국제학교 8학년 김동민, 이나경, 김현지 이 3명의 학생이 한 팀이 돼서 토론을 펼친 더 라이트 벌브스 팀이 우승을 차지했습니다. 교수님 어떤 점이 좀 주요를 했을까요?
예, 지금 아까 제가 과학에서
네.
인종이라는 거를 분류 기준으로 적용해야 할 것인가 말아야 할 것인가에 지금 찬성팀에서 약간의 좀 soft science, hard science라고 하면서 그게 적용이 돼야 할 부분이 있다.
네.
그렇지만 적용되지 말아야 할 부분이 있다라고 좀 차별화하면서 전략적으로 접근했던 것이 주요하지 않았나 생각을 하고요.
예.
근데 반대팀에서도 오늘 정말 잘했어요. 이게 지금
예.
5대4 판정이 나온 것만 보더라도
네네.
반대팀에서도 제 생각으로는 굉장히 잘했다고 생각을 해요.
그렇군요. 예.
근데 이제 아까 말씀드린 것처럼 POI도 좀 받으면서 좀 더 여유 있게 했었더라면 전략적에서 좀 더 좋았을 건데 그런 건 좀 아쉽네요.
그렇군요. 예. 자, 제5회 중학생 영어 토론대회 우승팀은 찬성팀의 의견을 펼친 더 라이트 벌브스 팀이 차지를 했고요. 그리고 안타깝게 뭐 떨어지긴 했지만 그래도 이 준우승을 차지한 조비스 팀도 수고했다는 얘기 박수를 드리고 싶습니다. 네, 오늘 도움 말씀에는 한국외국어대학교 통번역대학원 정철자 교수님이었습니다. 고맙습니다.
네, 감사합니다.
네, 그럼 이상으로 제5회 중학생 영어 토론대회 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 시청해주신 여러분 고맙습니다.